Hi, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to be welcomed by fellow greenheads is always awesome. So, as Mark said, my name is Sakib Siddiqui. I'm here representing Maize Tortilleria, which is a farm-to-table organization out of Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And today I'm going to talk about our philosophy, our reason for existing, and I'm going to talk you guys through a little bit about what we do with corn. We're going to talk a little bit about Nixtamalization, and afterwards I'll also talk about how we're actually growing the corn and the technology that we use to produce the maize, and the 3 different scales that we produce at. So to start off, I studied engineering, and so I'm not a chemist. I've never studied biology. So today I'm going to be talking about some of those subjects. So if I make any mistakes, feel free to correct me. But yeah, I started out on a weird path, very far away from food and farming. I actually worked in race cars out of university. And from a long story, which I'd be happy to share with anyone over a tasty beverage later, but maybe not a good time right now to go into that, but I ended up in food and farming. And I found myself doing urban agriculture and meeting with a lot of very forward-thinking people all throughout Toronto and other parts of the Greenbelt, which is a stretch of farmland that surrounds the GTA, the Greater Toronto Area. And got into urban agriculture, at first very much as a hobby. And then from there, one of my friends, a really good friend of mine whose family had a farm in the Greenbelt, his name is Antonio, he said he had an idea for new farming, as he called it, which incorporated a lot of principles of permaculture, biodynamics, cooperatives, and lean business in tech. So with that mishmash of all of our lived experiences between him, myself, and a few other people in our community, we started a place called Caballero Farms, which is 45 minutes outside of downtown Toronto. And we basically put in the basic infrastructure for this new type of farming. And our goal was twofold. It was to give places for all these great food-forward businesses that we were encountering in the city that were like, oh, can we do an aquaponics greenhouse? Or can we do a community garden? And we got tired of fighting for small real estate in the city when you had this amazing patch of greenbelt land surrounding the GTA. This is grade 1 soil. And on a clear day from the CN Tower, if you were to go up and look at that greenbelt, that represents almost 1/3 of Canada's grade 1 soil. Not Ontario's, Canada's grade 1 soil. And we're in a real rush right now in the GTA over the last 7 years to just pave it all and to build houses over it. But thankfully in the 90s, the Greenbelt Act was passed. And that prevented development in that area, and development has actually gone past that belt several hours north. And all these landowners were just sitting there with land that wasn't being productive, that wasn't being used. They bought it as maybe an investment. Maybe they were farming families and they no longer farmed it. And it was just sitting there. So the genesis was basically like, let's go to these landowners, let's tell them we'll put in the infrastructure, and let's connect them to these young farmers and these young entrepreneurs that don't have the capital, don't have the resources to be able to do something like this. So Caballero Farms was our first attempt at this. And one of the first businesses that we actually incubated was Maize. And I took an equity stake in that company because of one very important reason. It was when we had, and I don't want to, I go off on tangents a lot, so I apologize. I'll try my best to keep focused as much as I can. But in order to be able to afford the price of a 65-acre farm so close to a place like the GTA, you have to diversify your revenue model. So other than just production on the farm, we're also doing things like workshops and trainings, and as well as agritourism, events, parties, and things like that. So for Yvon, who was growing corn at first just for his restaurant, he was growing maize, he was trialing different seeds that he had brought up from Mexico. And we were figuring out what could grow in Ontario, what would work here. And he would bring people with him from his restaurant. At first I thought they were friends, but then I found out that these were customers. And these were customers that were willing to come up on a weekend. And city people, not rural people, city people who were willing to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and take a bus to go meet him somewhere and come up. And it was speaking to those people and how they said that for them, the smell of a nixtamal tortilla took them back to their grandmother's kitchen. It was that cultural resonance, it was that nostalgia, and the fact that people would literally have tears in their eyes when they would be telling me about how, imagine if you are used to eating bread every single day, right? And you have amazing bakeries that are providing you great quality product. Then you move to a foreign place and there's no bread. And all of a sudden you happen to stumble across a boulanger or a bakery and that smell hits you. Like, that was the reaction that people were having. So that was, from my personal standpoint, that's when I said, okay, this is something that's more than just a business. And it was what we are trying to incubate at the farm, which are triple bottom line businesses. Businesses that are environmentally and socially sustainable, as well as being economically and businessly sustainable. So today, what I'm going to do is, like I said, I've never even actually been to Mexico. I should preface that as saying I'm not an expert. I'm just someone who maybe for other people who are interested and want to do things like this, I'm maybe just 4 or 5 years further along. I'm by no means an expert in any of this stuff, but I'm just going to speak to my lived experience and what I know. But I've never been to Mexico, but I have spent a year making 3,000 to 5,000 tortillas a day by hand. And growing corn, and grinding it myself, and doing this. So that's been a wild ride, and it was great because I was lucky enough, and not just myself, but the other people that we work with, we were lucky enough to be able to start with values and work our way back to profit. And so today, what I'm here to give you a walkthrough is a circular economy model that we've created, where we're partnering farmers and landowners together and offering them the ability to value add and process their foods and access niche, culturally appropriate markets in the city. And we're doing so in a manner where we're not using any intermediaries or distribution partners, so we're able to pay the farmers a fair wage. We have direct relationships, we know the soil, we know the seed, we know the farmer. And for us, Maize and the cooperative farm in general, our values rotate around land management and land use, protecting the greenbelt specifically. The profession of farming, supporting farmers, and helping to make sure that in Ontario where we are, that farming doesn't die out, which is actually what's happening. Protecting seed biodiversity. And lastly, it's about principles of which all sort of fall in this umbrella of food security and food sovereignty. That means the right for a populace to have access to culturally appropriate and healthy foods. So with those values in mind, we started at first, like I said, just growing maize at Caballero Farm. And I'm gonna show you one here that is a dent corn. And we have this is a popping flint corn, but these are the most commonly grown corn in Ontario. It's actually more than 60% of what's farmed are these type of corns. And what's amazing is that north of Mexico, all this type of corn is used primarily for feed for animals. It's overlooked for human consumption, versus where if you were to go south of Mexico and into Mexico, it's grown primarily for human consumption. So what makes corn useful for Nixtamalization process, and how we sort of figured these things out and how we adapted it for the different types of maize that will grow in Ontario, that was a whole journey. And initially what was happening is that Yvon, who's my business partner, he spends a lot more time in Mexico than me. He went and he worked for 2 months in a tortilleria there. And he worked in fields there, and he started making these connections with all these different campesinas. And I'm gonna say this one off the record, but this is a white, this is a blue, and this is a pink Rosita corn. So off the record. He smuggled up these seeds in his socks, which is totally illegal. And so basically every time Yvon comes back, he's always sweating bullets going through customs because he has tons of just stuff that you should not have in a carry-on. So initially, where we began was trying to use this type of maize, which is what people expect it to taste like, and we know it works in the nixtamalization process the way we want it to, and will yield the outputs that we want. But the problem was, as you can see, they don't grow too well in Ontario yet. This is actually our second year, and we're going to continue planting and hardening these crops, and eventually, hopefully, we will end up with, these are the 3 that are most likely, that actually gave us crops. Some didn't even grow, right? So we'll continue working on that process and developing that. And actually, just to kind of break things up, I want to play a little game. I mentioned food security and food sovereignty, and some of those, I'm sure a lot of people are very familiar with those principles. One game we'll play that I like to play is, and this is, you can just vote by raising your hands, is if you have 3 days worth of food at your home, put your hands up. Cool. Who has a week's worth of food in their home? 4 weeks? Really? Impressive. That's impressive. Who has more than, let's say, a month or 2 worth of food in their home? You're a farmer, so you can put your hand down, right? or you just hoard dry grains or something, I don't know. Yeah, so this was, this to me, taking a step back, we sometimes refer to nixtamal as an inheritance. And the reason why I refer to nixtamal as an inheritance is that for the longest time, we maybe only until about 3 decades ago, we never understood how the Aztec were able to feed a population of 25 million off of mostly corn. The reason why is that corn, it carries a lot of essential amino acids and proteins that are very important to your diet. And one specifically is one referred to as niacin, which is very, very important for cellular regeneration. And for cellular regeneration. And the challenge is that if you're eating corn, which and a lot of vegetable proteins, they're incomplete. And in this case, the way corn is, okay, we're gonna get a little bit more silly here for a second. So who's eaten corn on the cob here before? And who's gone to the bathroom after they've eaten corn on the cob? Who's noticed that sometimes that kernel just shoots right through you like an express train? Like, yeah, right? So the reason why that is there's a skin on the corn. And this cellulose type skin is what stops you from being able to break down the maize. And the fact that the Aztec were able to unlock this more than 6,000 years ago drastically increased their ability to uptake nutrients. It meant that they could survive off mostly a diet of chilies, beans, and corn products like this. And this is something that, again, all these sort of things that I've been discussing right now about the different, the niacin and how crucial it is in being an amino acid and important for metabolic processes in our cells, and how adding it to an alkali or an alkali like this changes that balance and makes the niacin available to the body. This is something that we've only really understood in the last 30 years, but the Aztecs somehow, they knew this from 5,000, 6,000 years ago. And for us, I think it's just amazing how in a lot of their folklore and culture, they said, we are corn. And I look nowadays, and I maybe a lot of you can maybe empathize or kind of agree with this, is that if we go to the grocery store, like I couldn't imagine someone from Montezuma's civilization being able to imagine a Loblaws superstore or a Walmart superstore, right? Think of this vast warehouse. Now I want you to think about all the shelves in that grocery store. If we were to cut out cornstarch, corn syrup, and corn as feed for the proteins in the animals, how many aisles in the grocery store would you be left with? Maybe just the produce section, right? Yeah. Even that, like I drove up here in a rental car from Toronto, and there's cornstarch in my tires. There's cornstarch in toothpaste, in plastics, in textiles. Corn is magic. Like, if you think about it, it is something that I may have driven by cornfields my entire life, and I've never ever thought about any of these things. And as an organization, that is one of our major challenges, is transparency, is asking questions like, how did we end up in a situation where we do work with school children and they don't know that a seed needs to be planted in the soil to grow food, that we are in a situation where we have 4 large major corporations deciding what we eat. And I'm not talking about this from the perspective of good or bad. I mean, I think life is just, that's for us to live and to learn what's good and bad and to build perspectives and to make those decisions for ourselves. I'm not talking about good or bad. I'm just asking about being provocative and asking these questions. Why are farmers in Ontario getting priced out? Why are there no new farmers coming in? Why are we becoming more and more dependent on foreign imports? When we have crops that majority of farmers know how to work with and know how to grow very well and have all the equipment, and we have a populace that's now looking for local, gluten-free, all these things that Nixtamal products can supply. And as an organization, what we're doing is we're giving people the opportunity through technologies like social media, blogging, and even events like this to connect to their food, to ask more questions, and to give transparency. We know every single one of our farmers, and to kind of speak a little bit more about where Maize's gotten to in the last, Maize as a restaurant, the first restaurant was opened 7 years ago. As a wholesale and retail operation, and it's been growing its own food for 7 years. And as a wholesale and resale operation that we are now, this has probably been about 2.5 years in the making to where we've grown to now. And in that time, what our basic value proposition to people who aren't a part of these movements, who may not necessarily care about food security and food sovereignty, is this is food you know and trust. We have a complete control from the seed to the soil that it's grown in, to the transportation system, to the drying methods, to how it comes into our facilities, the way it's processed, the way it's packaged, the way it goes to the end consumer. And lastly, we close this cycle by sending all the food waste back to our farms. All of our table scraps, all of our customer waste, all of our trimmings, spoilage, whatever, you name it, all of it goes back to the farm. And we're a relatively small organization. We're a 45, 50-seater restaurant. We have another taco pop-up. We have the wholesale and retail operation. And we were able to divert almost 20,000 pounds of food waste last year. And we're able to, every week, connect people to these ideas that are very difficult sometimes for people to internalize, or they're not very inclusive, like permaculture, or biodynamics and these type of things, and we're able to relate it back into their food and to give them that connection. And that's really what Maize is. It's food you know and trust. It's transparent. And we feel like there's a place for more food like that in our food system. I'm not here saying that we should be switching to a completely localized food economy or food system. I think that's an oversimplification. But when I see a populace and a very diverse food-forward populace of Europeans, Asians, South Asians, Caribbeans, Latin Americans importing almost $1 billion worth of produce every year, and we're sitting on 30% of Canada's arable soil, and we can't keep farmers going. Like, you know, I think it's work like this that can help us achieve those things. And for a certain level for us, because we grow ourselves, because we farm, we're able to empathize with the farmer. We know how much work goes into that. When a farmer calls us and he says, hey, that seed that we trialed, it didn't work out too good, it didn't yield. I know in my head, I'm like, man, I know how many months of work that was to come in, and I ask him to trial that seed for me, for example, right? So that type of relationship where it's back and forth, and we're working with the farmers, and they're not just completely dependent on a distributor who takes the majority of their profit margin, and they don't have that connection. We're giving farmers the ability to access these niche cultural groups in the city, and we're giving the people in the city the ability to access their food and where their stuff is being grown from. Now I'm going to take the time to actually talk about what I think most people want to hear about is Nixtamalization. And one thing that I want to do real quick is Nixtamal, or that word Nixtamal, comes from a Nahuatl word. Nahuatl is one of the pre-Hispanic languages that has survived in Mexico. And it comes from the word nish, hold on, wait. So there's 3 different ways of pronouncing it, depending on who you speak with. So I had to get Yvonne to write it phonetically for me, because there's such slight differences, but it makes a big difference. Sorry. So Nixtamali refers to maize that's been softened in a wood lye solution. And the Spanish couldn't pronounce the word Nixtamali, so it became Nixtamali, and it became Nixtamal over time. And so when a lot of people say Nixtamal process, that's kind of like saying, hey, have a sip of this. This is made using kombucha process. Or hey, check out this beer. This is a beer process. No, the process is fermentation. So Nixtamal is not actually a process. From the origins of the word, words are powerful things, and words can become co-opted, and they can become trendy, and they can they can take on a life of themselves, and they can be very powerful. And Nixtamal comes from that word Nixtamali, which is a Nahuatl word, and it doesn't talk about a process. It talks about an end product, which I left in the car. But I do have with me, if anybody wants to check it out later, which is corn kernels that are ready to grind. So you can kind of touch them, you can feel that skin come off, and you can smell it and taste it if you wanted to. And that process is actually called slaking. So just technical jargon, not very important, but what we're actually doing is not nixtamalizing, it's a process called slaking. And there's different ways of doing it. There is the traditional method, which I brought up, which is using biochar or wood ash, which is something that we played around with at the farm. But for the most part, for our wholesale and retail operations, we use limestone, which technically the term for that is Nixtamali, which means corn that's been softened in limestone, in an alkaline limestone solution. So what essentially happens is we make an alkaline solution that we then add the dried maize to. And depending on the type of corn we're using, and depending on the end product, how it's going to be used, that dictates the pH of the water. It dictates the amount of water. It dictates the temperature in the different phases. So you have a very short cooking process and then a very long steeping process. So for us, it's a very short 5 to 15 minutes, depending on the specific type of corn we're using. And then we let it steep in its own solution overnight, and we grind it the next day. So that process is what allows this to bind together and to make masa. So when you break down that outer coating, that cellulose, you're also breaking down the cell walls within the maize itself and softening it. You don't want to cook it because you don't want to end up with a sticky paste that that's not what you want. You want to actually kind of have it al dente, like a little hard to the touch almost a little bit. And it varies for each maize, like the dents, the purple dents, which there's some chips that we're going to hand out in a bit. Actually, this is probably a good time. So this is perfect timing. So please try. And I would have loved to give everyone a fresh tortilla, but there's more people here than I thought there would be. And I'm a little bit rusty. I'm not as fast as I used to be pressing these tortillas, but I will press some, and I will encourage anyone who wants to try pressing one, and they'll get that chance later. How am I doing on time, by the way? I'm good? Okay. So this corn that you're eating here was grown in the Ottawa Valley by a farmer named Shelley Spruitt. And she was here last year, yeah. She says hi. I'll give you guys, this kind of segues into the actual growing of the maize and the technologies we're applying there. And really quickly, there's 3 different scales. There's our scale, where we're planting at less than an acre, 2 acres, and its majority of it is for crop trials and for developing seed stock, which I kind of touched earlier with these 3 different corns and how we're trying to harden them, and then eventually we may even try and crossbreed them. We'll see how that goes. And then we have another farmer, and so it's funny when we're talking about technology, because being a very tech-oriented person, someone who came from an engineering background, when I first got into this, I was like, yeah, we're going to apply automation, data acquisition, algorithms, blah, 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 touch screen, automate everything. And then it was a very strange way. It was like a city person who'd grown up in these engineering offices trying to find solutions for the technology that I was comfortable with. But for this scale of farming, we were doing, there's no margin. Farmers have to be their own accountant. They're their own customer service people. They're their own salespeople. Something breaks on the farm, you're your own mechanic. You don't have profit margin to be able to hire someone to do these kind of things. So we developed all this great technology, but we couldn't sell it to anyone because none of the farmers could afford to buy it. So it was really funny. It was a lot of people say I'm very lucky that I get to live a peri-urban lifestyle, where I get to split my time between urban living and rural living. And being on the farm, I've learned a lot, but it's almost an unlearning. Being able to connect to nature and look to nature and learn from it. And the analogy that I like to use, and a lot of these farming systems, whether you call it permaculture or whether you call it biodynamics, it's like a motorboat versus a sailboat. Industrial farming and the kind of farming that what we were coming in with our mindset of technology, it's a lot like forcing outcomes to happen. It's like that, it's that powerboat analogy where you're blazing along. But real systems that will help us cope with things like climate change and various other issues, geopolitical issues and other economic issues that we're facing, is we need more systems that work in concert with nature. So with that being said, we trialed 2 different methodologies of farming. Essentially, we had what our middle scale and what farmers like Shelley do, which is they have large tractors, they till, they have drill seeders. And really what their skill is in knowing the timing of when to do things, knowing when the soil is ready, and knowing where to source these high-quality seeds from. But for us, because we were small scale, and because we weren't really depending on it as our livelihood, we were able to be we were able to play around with things a little bit more. So I'll give you guys an example of how we grow our maize. So we use really complicated technology like cardboard and a sharp stick. And this is technology that dates back thousands of years of how corn was planted. So essentially what we do is we start off with a field. Now let's say that field has never been worked before, so there's high amounts of grass pressure or there's other plants in that space. So we will till with the tractor the year before, and then we will cover crop. Cover cropping is a method where you will plant something that's very hardy, that can outcompete the grass, but it has some sort of benefit for whatever is going to succeed in that space down the line. So one example is clover. We planted clover, rye, things like this that can just be broadcasted very easily. That'll keep the grass pressure down, won't let the grass and the weeds move in. And then next year when you go to plant, you can turn those plants back into the soil and they will help with whatever crop is going to be coming into that space next. So we start with that, we plant, and then we let our pigs into that area where all the cover crops are. And the pigs will eat everything. They are the best tillers. When the pigs are done working a certain section of the farm, you can go and you can put seed right into it. Now, obviously, you have to be careful because pig manure is very strong, so you have to monitor your nitrogen carbon balances in the soil. But again, I'm all over the place here, I apologize. But then we come in there and we have tons and tons of cardboard. We have takeaway boxes. We have a brewery down the street that has tons of cardboard. Everyone has cardboard. And corrugated, non-printed cardboard, we use that as mulch. And we also have tree removal companies that send their tree bits to the farm. So what we do is we'll measure out a row, we'll make mounds, we'll cover it in cardboard so no grass can move in. So what happens is the year before, the pigs till, that's ready to be planted in. We cover it. All winter, that decomposition happens with whatever cover crops were underneath. Next year, we're ready to go. We cover it in cardboard before it gets too warm so the grass doesn't come up. And at that point, we just take a wheel hoe. We have this tool called a wheel hoe. It's like a bicycle with a frame, and we just put like a keel at the end of it. So you can just run, it's one wheel, and you just put it down, and you push it like this, and it makes a nice row, and someone goes behind with a stick, puts a hole, drops corn, puts a hole, drops corn. Someone behind them follows them with beans and squash. And so we're able to basically plant, and we're able to do it in a way which doesn't require us to hire a lot of labor, doesn't require us to burn a lot of diesel. And we're able to grow just as much corn as we would be on that scale of farming with that large equipment. Because that equipment breaks down, it gets stuck in the field. Right now, it's way too wet. With this type of methodology, we were able to beat the medium and large scale farmers who are using technology that can't get that technology out into the fields. We were still able to plant on time using these hand methods of technology. So I guess what I'm saying is that for us, at first, what we're doing now is we're taking a lot of the technology that's available to big-scale farmers, automation, data acquisition, all these type of things, and we're trying to combine that with the best of yesterday, indigenous knowledge of farming, and even like the small rural communities that we get to interact with, they have all this knowledge and it's just lost, it's not being passed on to anyone. So we're trying to do something kind of like the Fibonacci sequence, where it's just something that you see a lot in being in nature, right? And what is it? It's a mathematical sequence that you see over and over in nature, and it's the last two numbers in the sequence combined. So you basically take the next number in the sequence and you add the last number in the sequence. That's what I like to think what we're doing, is with that motorboat and sailboat analogy, is that we're trying to take the technology and all these resources that we have and figure out how it can work in concert with nature. And by then creating a model where we are connecting private landowners with forward food-thinking businesses, giving them food hubs in the city to process, and connecting it all with this agritourism and zero waste models, we're trying to create a circular economy model that can make this scalable. So right now, we've been able to make this work for us. We have a business that's working in the city, but now we're shipping product to Calgary. We have people asking us for product in Montreal. So essentially, when we are able to hit a certain capacity, we can approach a farmer in that region, in Calgary, and say, we want to use Calgary corn now. We can give them the seed, we can give them the best practices, we can give them the manual. We can create a processing facility in a town like Calgary, and we can scale this model. And now we have something that, for the first time in a long time of doing this type of food and farming work, we have something that has profit margin and scalability to help us achieve these long-term goals of increasing food security and food sovereignty for all Canadians. And so let's see here. I kind of talked about how we go from saving seed to learning how to plant it, to drying it, slaking it, grinding it. Oh, so the processing side, all the equipment comes from Mexico. In Mexico, they have all the technology for these things. But unfortunately, what's happened is that with the flooding of subsidized GMO corn into Mexico, you're basically, even this tradition of what we're doing here is dying out. So Yvon travels a lot, and he works with a lot of campesino movements. And these are movements that are trying to protect nixtamal, corn farming in Mexico. And on his most recent trip, or every time he goes, he brings back these seeds. And so we don't know the genetic name of these seeds. This is obviously a white dent corn of some kind, because this was given to him by a family, the Quintari family. So this is just known as white Quintari. Like, that's how it is in Mexico. There's no scientific names for things. That family's just been growing the corn for a while. So it's just whatever the race is with their name attached to it. And so I asked him, I'm like, what should I tell people when I show them these corns? This is obviously blue. This is obviously a pink rosita, conical rosita. And he's like, yeah, it's from my friend's Eric's farm. I can't remember his last name. And it's like, okay. So then it's just funny to think of how, like, and then we work with farmers like Shelly, for example. And Shelly's a really, really gifted farmer. And what she's amazing at is she goes to these conferences worldwide, and she finds amazing seeds, heirloom varieties of seeds. We are actually growing a variety called Spanish Red, which is from Spain. So think about it. Corn exists in Central and North America. The Spanish come here. They take corn back to Spain. It's been growing there for all these years. Now we took seeds and we're growing it in Ontario, and we're turning that into Mexican products and selling it back to Mexican people. Like, it's crazy, right? And so what we want to be able to do with this sort of localized circular economy, and by giving people from the city the opportunity to get involved with these farms, is we're letting the farmer focus on what they do best. In any other industry that I've worked in, whether it was manufacturing, race cars, anything else, if I wanted to manufacture that chair, there's an expert in the woodworking. There's an expert in the chemicals that seal the wood. There's a textiles expert. There's a person who does the fasteners, the buttons. Everything is broken up into verticals and is specialized. Why are organic farmers have no access to these economies of scale, to these vertical systems, to any of this technology? They're doing everything on their own. Shelly, someone who has an innate ability to be able to find seed and figure out just from her intuitive senses that what would or wouldn't work in Ontario. That's what I want her to do. I'm going to show you that's all you should be doing. Let us take care of everything else. And so, in the same vein, now this GMO corn that's flooding into Mexico, basically people are stopping to grow corn because there's no money in it. They can't compete. And you have these basically maseca powder, which is a dehydrated version of this corn. So you essentially make the masa and then you dehydrate it into a powder, and you add a whole bunch of stabilizers and wheat and a few other things to it, and you sell it as an instant powder. And if I can kind of relate the taste of one versus the other, it's sort of like having mashed potatoes and then instant mashed potatoes. Like, nobody prefers the box stuff. But it's what's happened is that people's grandmothers did it this way, but then their mothers worked and other things changed, and it was out of convenience and other reasons they started using these powders, and now in almost 2.5 generations, it's almost disappeared. In the city, this is considered antique. In rural parts of Mexico, this is considered not traditional, but like artisanal. And yeah, you still see this culture in some small communities or in villages of Mexico, but for the most part, there's nobody making money doing this kind of work in Mexico. So on the last trip, and every trip he goes, Ivan gets seeds, and he goes to this place called Chiapas, which are these farmers, this community that he's very close with, who are subsistence farmers. And they bless the seed. And he brings it up here and we plant it. And now what we're trying to do is we're trying to establish direct relationships with campesinos in Mexico, and we want to start bringing corn from there as well. Because the Canadian corn does taste different. So we're trying to work with both the hardiness, the yield, the sustainability, and the taste as well. So again, the right to culturally appropriate, healthy food for all Canadians. And so that equipment that we bring up from Mexico, they always ask us, they're like, what are you doing with this stuff? Because it's made specifically for Nixtamal, 100% corn. It's adapted differently if you're using wheat or the instant powders, right? They're like, what do you want to do with this stuff? And they were so blown away to hear that there's people growing maize in this traditional way, that they're drying it, nixtamal, making it into nixtamal and grinding it, and that it's a business that's thriving and making money, because this doesn't happen in Mexico, so they couldn't even believe that this is happening in Ontario. So on the last trip, he met with this place, which is the National Foundation of Tortillas. And they gave him actually these seeds, which is the ancestor of corn, which is a grass. And so that's something great that we like to show off, and we're going to be planting that as well too. But that's sort of the whole process. We're bringing up this equipment. He still uses traditional volcanic stones to grind the corn, the same way it was used 5,000 years ago. And it's just pure corn. There's nothing else. And I think that's the entire process of how we're growing corn, how we're trying to figure out what can be grown in Ontario and how we can cross it. And so just to kind of tell you, this dent and this flint corn, this was given to us by a farmer who started a cooperative in a place called Woodsville, Ontario. His name is Mark Tricot. And this guy was a rock star for me growing up because he built a cooperative. He was in with the Mennonites, in with the Amish, and they don't let anybody into their communities, right? And he brought us corn. He would bring us corn from these communities, and we were like, man, he would go down to farmers markets, and his entire truck would be pre-sold. He would go to 2 or 3 of the best markets in the city, and even a guy like that has been priced out, and he's moved to Vermont. He left Ontario because it's just getting priced out. It's too expensive, or there's not enough people, or yeah, it's just really interesting what's going on there. But for us, it's about finding the right balance between the sugars and the starches in the corn, and continuing to figure out what else can be grown here in Ontario that can be used for us. I think I'm just going to kind of keep it very conversational now. And if anybody has any questions, they can feel free to answer them. Come here, you can take a look at the corn, and whoever wants to stamp a tortilla is more than welcome to stamp a tortilla.
Hey.
Hi.
Thanks. Very interesting. So I'm here to talk about alcohol.
Yeah.
Do you know if any attempt with nixtamal corn for distilling? Have you heard about this?
So I've heard of corn beer. So I know that corn can be used to make beer, and we were actually trying to work with using the purple corn. And we were in talks with one of our brewery partners in Toronto to play around with this stuff. But yeah, that's something that's in the books. We've not worked with it. I'm not sure what the nixtamalization, the nixtamal, how that would affect the brewing of the beer, though. Yeah.
Yeah, because the pH must be higher considering it's alkaline.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's. I would be very curious to try this because normally, you know, like for a bourbon whiskey, there's often a sour mash process, so the pH is lowered. So, but yeah, I was talking earlier about the fact that the best craft bourbon in the U.S. are made from red corn.
Yeah, and
so
red corn grows really well here. So, and that Spanish red is an example of that red corn, and we use it quite a bit. So if you're looking to get your hands on some.
I'm just like curious to know the difference and know, but yeah,
so,
I mean, I can try, sure.
Yeah, so it's basically there, from corn size, there's obviously kernel size difference, but then there's a difference between the complex and the simple carbohydrates that are within that corn, right? So you'll have some corn that's going to turn more into like sugars, and some that's going to be more starchy, essentially, right? So sweet corn versus starchier corn. So red corn is a starchier variety. So that corn grows very well here. So I don't see why you couldn't use it in a similar way for any of those processes.
And with the nixtamalization, like. How would you describe the taste change in the process? Let's say a red corn, a straight red corn, and a nixtamal red corn.
It is. I don't know how to describe that because if I was to take that corn and say and grind it into a cornmeal and use it for cornmeal applications, it would be a very different taste because by making it alkaline, the food itself is actually alkaline, which is, I don't know if it's super popular in Montreal, but when we tell people our pigs are on an alkaline diet in Toronto, people are like blown away. But yeah, it tastes, if you were to eat this raw, it does have a little bit of that alkalinity, like that baking soda is, like that note of it there. Generally what we find is that it enhances because there's nothing else. There's just water. It's just water and corn. So you're getting a very concentrated flavor of that corn where you have to be, and it depends. So each color is an indication of different compounds that are existent within that corn. And they all react differently to this nixtamalization process. So depending on how alkaline, there's obviously degrees of alkalinity as well. So if you're trying to preserve a certain taste, you may want to go less alkaline as possible, right? While still being able to achieve that nixtamalization. But then, for example, with a purple or a blue corn, the more alkaline you take it, the more you preserve that color. And believe it or not, you taste things through color as well. Sometimes I'll give someone a purple tortilla and they'll go, it tastes like purple. I'll be like, what does that mean? But so it's tough, and we're trialing a lot of these things and playing with them. But I find that red corns in general, like my mother's Indian, and so she makes rotis at home, and I find that pure red corn masa tastes a lot like flour, like wheat. Like the smell of it and the taste of it, it has those notes in it. And we're always up for experimenting and trialing, and that's basically how we do things. So if we ever had some sort of hypothesis or something that we wanted to try out, we just do it and see what would come out. Yeah.
That's the way.
Right?
I see you have this frying pan there. Have you tried like popcorn out of this or?
Yeah. So this is actually popcorn here. And so we, so like a red corn that you're mentioning that's used in bourbon, that's actually a little bit closer to popping corn. And popping corn is just corn that has, it's a smaller kernel size, and they don't have any dent in them, which allows them to basically have that popping effect when the skin comes apart. But all corn will pop if you put it in enough heat, right? But it won't taste good, or it will get burnt, or it won't pop the right way. It'll still be very hard. But yeah, like and it was funny that the other day, one of the guys while making nixtamal, he spilt a bag of red corn onto the burners, started popping, and he's like, "Oh, it's popcorn!" And like in his head, he'd been working in this place for months, and he never thought, right, popcorn, yeah. But yeah, I don't know, it's funny. Mm-hmm.
Nice. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you.